Hello from Gruhn Guitars. I'm George Gruhn. Today is May 28th, 2021. We've had another busy week. Guitar sales are good. It's a rainy day. Nothing better to do for folks than to come on in and look at guitars. There's not much to do outdoors today, at least not in Nashville. We have plenty of questions from listeners. And I'll start with one from Mark D. Says, I have a late 1930s or early 1940s big body guitar that is clearly a Regal Chicago-made jumbo in the same style as the Recording King, Washburn and Regal brand models. But this one is labeled as Bacon and Day Senorita. Although Regal did make most of the B&D guitars, I have not seen one of this Regal jumbo style branded as a B&D. Have you ever encountered a similar example? Well, since I don't have a photo of your guitar, it's hard for me to give you a straight answer to your question. However, I have seen plenty of virtually identical guitars with the Regal brand, Washburn brand, and B&D. So I certainly would not be surprised to see this. The Bacon Senorita models vary on the guitars from relatively plain to some that are quite fancy with a lot of ornamentation. But what they do seem to have in common is that all of those Bacon Senorita guitars were made by Regal. And Regal also made archtop guitars for B&D. And the Sultana models were as big as 18 inches and were actually quite good. The body construction was really on par with some quite expensive guitars, but in general, the Regal necks were not as good as a Gibson neck. They did not have an adjustable truss rod. And in general, the neck shaping just was not as sophisticated. So that overall, I would say that the Regal brand guitars were of good quality, but the necks simply were not of great quality. They didn't play as smoothly as a Gibson or a Martin. But so far as being surprised to see one with the B&D brand, not at all. So anyway, we have another question that I think is right up the line for Greg, my repair shop foreman. So I'm going to put him on with the question.
Right here.
And here's the guitar.
Cool. Hello, everyone. So one of the questions that George asked me to answer on the program was by John P. He asked, this may have been addressed before, but I was wondering if George or one of the repair shop guys can address the long debate topic of floating the bridge on a Strat. Does the shop prefer it to be floated, decked, or blocked? Great question. So it really all depends on the instrument and really the player. This one is Vince Gill's L&L. They also made mention of this very specific instrument, also how's Vince Gill's LSL guitar set up, and does Vince ever use a tremolo bar? It really has to do with the piece. Now, I'm sure Vince has many Strats and he has them set up in different ways, but there's pros and cons to each. So this one is set up, if you guys can see it, with the bridge completely bottomed out against the instrument there. You can't even lift it up because there's so many springs, and then the two screws underneath the plate are tightened up almost all the way, and therefore it's a non-functional trem. Okay. Well, what you get with that is an instrument that has a great deal more sustain because everything is nice and solid. So that's one of the pros in in tightening up the bridge so it lays flush against the body like that is really the sustain. I actually prefer to have the bridge float about a 32nd of an inch from the back. And I always drop a ruler right behind it and I measure how much it floats from the back. Now that does two things. One of them is it makes for a functional tremolo, okay, which is great, but also it actually loosens up the tension of the strings. So when you find yourself bending a note, the bridge, the back of the bridge actually helps along with that because it's not fixed to the body, right? So a 32nd of an inch is enough to have a functional tremolo and to give you that slinky feeling, which is great. If you give it a full 16th of an inch, 2/32, as far as a rise goes, which is still a very small amount, that's enough for you to pull back on the tremolo a hair and to use that, you know, to give you another little flavor if that's your playing style. But it's you know, there's advantages and disadvantages to both. I would think a full 32nd of an inch floating would make for a great feeling instrument. I would say it would give you enough. You would notice it enough to where a set of 10s might feel like 9.5s if it's floating just a hair. Okay, hope that that helped everyone out. And that's that. I'll get George back here on the program. I'm sure he's got more questions as well. Hope that was a help. Take care, guys.
Now, I can add one comment, and that is as far as how Vince's LSL guitar is set up. It's set up exactly the way he had it. We did not do any setup work on it. We left it as it was, the way he used it. And this is a guitar that he used quite a bit on stage and on road shows. So Opry, on tour, etc. This is a guitar that Vince played quite extensively. So anyway, that hopefully answers that question. Ken said, I have several 1950s Martin guitars, mostly style 18 of various sizes. Also one D28 from 1955. I also have a 1941 D18. Which group would or has the most potential for appreciation? Are the 1950s being swept up in value due to the high prices of pre-wars, or will pre-war guitars continue to outpace them? Well, this is time to bring out the crystal ball. Here we go. Used to be, I said I didn't have a crystal ball to answer such questions, but here it is. And as I've said a number of times in the past, if we hold something up to the crystal ball, as you can see, it comes out magnified and pretty well right side up. It tells you where things are right now. But if you look through the crystal ball, what you see is everything you're seeing through it that way is upside down. And in some ways, that's a bit like trying to make predictions for the future. Or as Yogi Berra would probably have said, it's really hard making predictions because they're about the future. And that hasn't happened yet. And things have a way of often enough not following quite what you would have predicted. But given that, I would still say that the style 18 guitars and just Martin guitars in general of the 1950s are quite different from the guitars of the 1930s. The 1930s guitars had Adirondack red spruce tops, and they had scalloped bracing. And prior to late 1938, they had what is called forward shifted scalloped bracing, in which the X crosses very close to the sound hole Whereas on the rear shifted that came in by late 38, the X cross is a bit further away from the sound hole, further down on the body. And they do sound a bit different. Also, neck dimensions changed pretty significantly after about the first quarter of 1939. They went from a 1 3/4 inch neck at the nut, and also a pretty considerable taper where the necks were much thicker by the 12th fret than they were at the first, to a less radical taper and a 1 11/16 inch wide nut. So, and then again in 1945, by then they had, actually very late 44, shifted from the scallop bracing to non-scalloped. And then by 46, they were using Sitka spruce and non-scalloped. And the ones of the 50s and late 40s are basically, again, the Sitka spruce top, non-scalloped bracing, and 1 11/16 inch nut width. The style 18s from 47 onward until recently were rosewood fingerboard and bridge, whereas the pre-war models and 46 on back were ebony. And in the last few years, they've gone back to the forward shifted scallop bracing and ebony board and bridge and a 1 3/4 inch nut width, but they have an adjustable rod. Martin, since 85, have adjustable rods in the neck. And the new ones actually are built significantly more like the 1930s guitars, but do not have Adirondack tops on the standard D18, although you can get that on custom order. And we have that. But the point is, a brand new D18 has many rather desirable features that you don't get from a 50s guitar or a 60s guitar or even a late 40s guitar. So what I see in general is that the pre-World War II models, those from the 30s, are going to continue to be the true golden era guitars. They're older now than they used to be. When I opened up the shop, a 1940 guitar was only 30 years old, because 1970, January is when we opened. Minus 30, that's 1940. Today, the guitar is much older, but the fact is the golden era hasn't changed. The great golden era for Martin steel string guitars, in my opinion at least, is from 1928 through late 1938 for the absolute most sought after steel string Martins. But the new ones have many features that are remarkably like that. And the custom shop guitars that we feature here, that we order in considerable quantity and promoted quite heavily, feature the same type Adirondack spruce that was available pre-World War II. Except that on many of the guitars that we're doing, the ones with sinker mahogany have mahogany that was cut many years ago, and those sound really great. The combination of sinker mahogany that was cut in Belize, where the trees were cut from 100 to 150 years ago and then floated down the river to the sawmill, and about 30% would sink and have been underwater since then until they just now are bringing them up. Those are great sounding guitars. So will a 50s guitar be as valuable or catch up in value with the golden era period? I don't think so. But will it continue to still have value? Yes. It's like, which would you rather have? Two $5 bills or a $10 bill? Well, I don't care. I'd take either one and be perfectly happy. You can give me 5 20s or $100 bill. $100 bill, I guess, has the advantage it takes less space in the wallet, but we're spending often enough. The 520s would be more convenient if you were buying some smaller purchases. But with the guitars, the new Martins today, especially some of the custom guitars, the Authentic series and customs such as the ones that we are carrying, those are doing very well and are highly competitive with many of the guitars made in the 60s and the 50s and even into the late 40s. And I've often said that, in my opinion, some of the new guitars that we feature right now with Adirondack spruce top and forward shifted scallop bracing are some of the best guitars made in my lifetime. I was born August 21st, 1945. So this coming August, I will be 76. And new Martins are good, and that can be a good alternative for a player. The new one may not be collectible, but the best ones for a player are either new, or in many cases, the choice is new versus the golden era, but the difference in price is very considerable. That golden era model may cost you 10 times as much, and sometimes more than that. So the 50s still had some great guitars. There are some very good ones, but quite consistently, some of the new custom guitars from Martin and even the new standard line guitars from Martin compare remarkably well. And in many cases, I feel are superior to the ones from the 60s, and frequently enough, superior to most of the ones made during the 1950s. So guitars can be 50 years old and not be as good as some of the brand new ones. Specs have changed, and new ones are really good. So far as collecting, if you're collecting strictly for appreciation, I think that the true golden era are still the best. But quite honestly, if you're collecting only for appreciation, if you're buying them as you would stocks or bonds, in all probability right now, you may be able to find other things that are more sure so far as appreciation. Lots of people are buying gold and silver, and I can't truly tell you how much they're going to go up in value, but I do know that new ones are giving some of the old ones a real run for the money right now, but they're not beating the golden era, either in electric guitars or acoustic. But they're getting close enough that you can take them on stage and do very well with them, or in the studio. And in many cases, the new ones are better than acoustic guitars of the 1950s or 60s, but they're not better than the true golden era. And so far as electric guitars, the new electrics by the better makers are also very good. But do I think that they're better than the golden era pre-CBS Fenders or the Ted McCarty era Gibson electrics? No, I don't. But they're surprisingly close in some cases, but they certainly don't have the collectability. And ultimately, no, I don't think that they're better than the originals. I still think the golden era guitars are unsurpassed. But there are new builders today who are building very good instruments. And when I say unsurpassed, I'm talking mainly about major manufacturers like Martin, Fender, Gibson, etc. And those are companies that have been in business for a long time. But individual custom luthiers, they don't fit in that mold. Some of them are highly overrated, in my opinion, and some of them are perhaps underrated. But what human hands did once can be done again. And good materials are still available, especially for a small-time builder who's not doing more than a dozen guitars a year, or even 30 guitars a year. They can get access to some very fine wood. And if their skill is good enough, there is absolutely no reason why they can't make a guitar, banjo, or mandolin that's as good as any of the past. It's just a matter of taking the time to do it right. It has to have the right design, the right structural workmanship, the right materials, and ultimately good cosmetics, because cosmetics do help to sell it. if it sounds great, feels great, looks great, there's no reason why it shouldn't actually be great and be valuable and be just as good to use as any other. So use your own judgment. You know how it feels, how it looks, and how it sounds to you. But past performance is no guarantee of future. And that means, at least with respect to investment, I can't tell you exactly how much appreciation there will be. We are at a time when a generation of millennials is having a midlife crisis, similar to what the baby boomers had in the mid-'80s. That drove prices up then, and it seems to be doing the same now. So do I feel positive about the direction of the market right now? It's doing well. Business is prospering, and companies like Martin, Fender, Gibson, Guild, Taylor, Collings, they're back ordered. They cannot keep up with the demand. And that's likely to continue for some time. I don't think it's simply a very temporary blip. I don't think it's all because of people coming out of their shell because of COVID virus diminishing in the US and mask mandates being gone, although we are now at Gruhn Guitars, as of a couple of days ago, no longer mandating masks in the shop, and we are no longer limiting the number of people in the showroom. The door is unlocked. We are open for business fully. Don't need an appointment. Don't need to worry so much about extreme social spacing. So we are not limiting the number of people in the showroom, and so it's not creating any problems at all. We're not deluged, but we do have more visitors now. And in general, people have a very positive attitude. They're happy to be able to come in. So onward, a related question from Peter. How are the custom shop new D28 Authentics Rosewoods different from the custom Gruhn D28 Rosewoods you have on order per the Gruhn custom specs, with non-torrified Adirondack tops, etc.? Well, again, there are several different variations of the Authentic series, but here is Gruhn models. This is a new D28 built to my specs. It is a standard dreadnought body size, and it is basically standard herringbone style 28 ornamentation. You can see the herringbone edge trim, standard 28 rosette, the tortoise shell grain binding, ebony fingerboard and bridge, the slotted diamond fingerboard inlays like the pre-World War II models had. These have the Schaller vintage replica type tuners, which are very good quality. On Martin's Authentic series, they have Waverleys. These tune smoothly, so do the Waverleys. They're excellent gears. The standard catalog model Authentic series Martins on the Sound 28s have Madagascar rosewood, but they've recently come out with one variation of the Authentic that's available through a limited number of special authorized dealers that has non-torrified Adirondack, which is what this has, Gruhn model. And this one has the performance taper. So this neck is a fairly modern taper. It is not as thick a neck, and the spacing at the bridge is not as wide as on the Authentic series. This is their standard spacing, but it is 1 3/4 at the nut, and it's their standard spacing at the bridge. So the spacing, string spacing at the bridge is a bit narrower here, although it's the spacing that was standard as of after the first quarter of 1939, and it's a size that most people like. These have Indian rosewood, and the new authentic that has the non-torrefied top and is to a limited number of dealers also like this, has a adjustable rod. So the authentics that have the Madagascar rosewood have a steel T-bar, non-adjustable, and the newest ones available through only a limited number of dealers have the truss rod like this, adjustable. So how does this differ from that newest version of the authentic available to a limited number of dealers? The neck contour on this is more modern. This has Schaller rather than Waverly. This has Indian rosewood, as does the new one that I've been describing, this limited number of dealers. This has a gloss finish, and the new authentic has a thinner, low gloss finish. The wood grain really doesn't pop as much, but it's a thinner, slightly thinner finish. The sound is a little bit more trebly. It's very close. This is a little bit mellower sound. And one other notable difference that affects price, this has Martin standard glue, and the new one has Hyde glue, the one that's available through a limited number of dealers. We at Gruhn do not hear a difference in sound that we can discern between Hyde glue versus the new glue, the standard glue on the modern Martins. And we don't see a reason to pay extra for it as a result. We do hear some difference in the finish. This finish is a little bit mellower sound, but overall, so far as tonal quality, we like this every bit as well, if not better. The price differential is significant. The Gruhn model is $3,800 with a hard shell Geib style case, not the molded plastic case. And the other model, the newest of the finish that is not relict, but the new one you're inquiring about is $1,200 more than this. So far as playability, the neck dimensions are a matter of personal preference, but we find that most of the people like the neck dimension that we have. Tommy Emmanuel was in a few days ago, and he preferred the neck dimension and playability of ours. And he liked the tone equally on both. So they're both very good. The tone is slightly different. The feel is significantly different because the neck is different in dimension. But they are both good guitars. We have a question from Mark. It says, I'm thinking of purchasing a Taylor 814 CE West African fingerboard, ebony fingerboard, which shows variations in the color of the board. And that wood is coming from Cameroon, where Taylor has an ebony mill that they have helped to fund. And this is, they're actually doing a great job. They're funding a school and medical care and other, giving a living wage to people there who have never been treated that way before. And they're doing a great job on conservation. Much of the ebony that used to be cut there, would cut down a tree and then do a sample cut on it to see if it had uniformly dark wood, and if it had white streaks in it, they just let it rot on the ground. Now Taylor is harvesting all of it, because so far as the quality of the wood for use on a guitar is exactly the same. So if you have some lighter colored streaks in the wood, gives a character so far as playability as a guitar. It's every bit as durable. It serves every bit as well for functioning as a fingerboard. So Taylor is promoting that wood, which is good conservation. And it certainly is not good forest management to let wood rot that is perfectly usable. Um, so Mark goes on asking, is it better to have the mixed color from darker to lighter or just darker on the fingerboard? The color of the wood does not affect how good it is as a fingerboard. So there is no sacrifice whatever being made to utility, sound, playability, if you have the wood that has streaks in the grain color. He also goes on to ask, is there much difference in the sound when comparing the newer 814 models with the older 814s that didn't have the V bracing? Well, the older ones have X bracing, and the new ones have the Andy Powers design V bracing. And there is a subtle difference in the sound, but they both are capable of good sound. And I happen to feel that the new Taylors are as good as any Taylors the company has ever made. I don't feel that there's any real sacrifice being made in getting a new Taylor versus their earlier design. Andy Powers is a brilliantly talented designer and craftsman. Bob Taylor went to great lengths to find a person who would fit the goals he had for someone young enough to be able to carry on the Taylor tradition, creative enough to be able to expand upon that vision and be adaptable over time, knowledgeable enough that he really knew guitars backwards and inside out, and would be skilled enough as a craftsperson to be able to design and personally be able to build prototypes to test theories and make sure that something was right, but also somebody who would be able to work in a factory setting and understand how a factory works, aside from just how an individual luthier works with hand tools. So Andy fit that, and new Taylors are very good instruments as Taylors go. It's a different sound from a Martin. And if you want the sound of a Martin, the Taylor is something different. I can also say that most of the Taylors are voiced where they really function perfectly, coupled with pickup system, whereas Martins, to me, still are an ultimate purely acoustic guitar. But I'm used to the Martin sound and feel, and my personal favorites tend to be that. But I also have Taylors that I've played that are very impressive now. And I'd have to say that Taylor is doing guitars good enough that they deserve serious attention. I've seen not only production models, but also handmade prototypes that Andy Powers has done that are, no doubt about it, very good. And there will be more coming from him and from Taylor. So Taylor has gone a long way in a short time. The company was founded in 1974, and they are now making more acoustic guitars annually than any other USA maker. So they are producing quantity and quality, and it is impressive to see what they've done. But I can also say that it's impressive to see what others are doing. And the new Martins that are being made right now, the models that I've been promoting as Gruhn Design, are very impressive guitars. And again, I'm saying that these, in my opinion, are some of the absolute best Martins made in my lifetime. And I expect to see good things still coming from Martin as well. So this is a good time for guitar builders. There's a demand, and we still have availability of materials. Knowledge of guitars is very strong, and the demographics of the market are good. We have the younger element of baby boomers still buying. We have the millennials who are now in their early 40s starting to re-enter the market and buying heavily, more heavily than they ever did before. And we have the children of the millennials who are very much steeped in this culture. They are interested in guitars. I've often said that I think that Generation X is the one that didn't seem to support the guitar market much, and that was also a time that was very tough for guitar builders. Individual luthiers as well as manufacturers were having a tough go of it from 76 through the mid-80s. But from the mid-80s onward, guitar builders have thrived. And that has not changed. We've had ups and downs in the economy. We've had some shifts demographically. But the fact is, from the mid-80s to the present, the guitar market has been remarkably good and is now a much bigger market than it was previously. There's a lot more guitars being made in the USA today than ever before. On the other hand, they are higher end guitars. So what I'm not counting is how many guitars companies like Harmony, Kay, and Regal made. It was considerable, but even there, I'd have to say that I don't think that when you add it up, even with those counted in, that in the 1940s, 50s, or into the 60s, I don't think that even throwing what they made into the equation, that there were as many guitars being made in the USA as are being made right now. So, but it is worth noting that Taylor has a Mexican factory, so does Martin, so does Fender, and there's a lot of guitars made in Asia, imports, that are of far better quality than student models were when I opened up my shop, and sure enough, better than they were in the 1950s or 60s. Early Kay and Harmony guitars just weren't very well made. The bodies were made a bit better than the necks, but the necks were the weak link in many cases. They just didn't have a truss rod that worked. If they had a truss rod and adjustable rod at all, it was sort of what I call a placebo rod. You could turn it, but nothing good happened. And the dovetail joints weren't very well fit, and the necks were shaped with more by hand than they didn't have CNC machines. And when you're doing it by hand, if you're making student models and not putting much time into each neck shaping, the feel of the neck made on a Harmony is nowhere near what it is on a Martin or a Gibson of the old days. But when necks are cut by a CNC machine, it can be accurate to within 1/1000th of an inch. It's just as easy to program a good shape as a mediocre shape. And now even student model guitars have remarkably good necks as far as the neck contour and even the fit of the dovetail joint and the fit of the truss rod. It's the truss rod routing in the body is very precise, and that makes for far better quality. Brian says, you mentioned that you were looking for questions for your Friday conversation, so I thought I'd send one. You stated the Martin 0028 was a favorite of blues players. I certainly agree. Having said that, what other modern acoustic guitars do you see as being particularly suited to the blues? Blues is a pretty wide diversity of sounds. So a lot of blues music was composed and played on very funky, cheap instruments in the past. And that's the sort of thing that is likely in ongoing to be uh, a factor that not everything has to be very high grade to have a good bluesy sound. You want sound with character and personality. But Martin dreadnoughts in general, most people think are not as bluesy sounding as their single O, double O, and triple O sizes. And for Gibson, actually, many of the Gibsons of almost any size seem to appeal quite well to blues players. But of course, Martin and Gibson guitars, it's a pretty broad category when you consider that Gibson was incorporated in 1902. They've had lots of design changes over the years in what they make, a lot of diversity in that. And the same can be said of Martin. The new Martins are not the same as the Martins of the 70s and Martins of the 30s also, but very different. But in general, Gibson made guitars as big as their 17-inch wide J200 that have appealed very much to many blues players. And then the smaller ones do as well. So there's good Gibsons, if it's from a good time period, which can be either very new or some of the ones from the 50s on back, they're particularly good. I think that by after the mid 60s and through the 70s, the sound of Gibson acoustics just doesn't appeal to me until we get some of the more modern ones that are more copied after the old ones. So we do have some new Gibsons that are quite good sounding, but some of the worst sounding Gibsons would be in acoustics from the 70s. They have double X bracing, and they changed and cheapened the design very considerably under Norland. And I don't consider them very desirable for any kind of music. But almost all Gibson models of the 1950s, anything with X bracing on up, so from guitars like an LG2 on up, were very good blues guitars. The LG1 and the LGO with transverse ladder bracing, frankly, didn't sound near as good. But that's only two models. The rest of them were all quite good. So blues can be played on such a wide variety. It's going to be a matter of figuring out what works for you. But in general, guitars that are really beautifully smooth and mellow may not sound bluesy. Blues players like something with a bit of an edge to it and a certain funkiness to it. But again, blues is such a wide category. You know, when you consider how many different styles of blues there are and how many different musicians have played blues, you get guys who had everything, especially on electric sound, from syrupy smooth to pretty raw funky. So we don't have a straight answer for you. But there are almost all the Martin guitars are perfectly capable of being used for blues, but I particularly think that in general, the ones with the smaller sizes, or at least not the dreadnoughts, are the ones that in the Martin guitars are the most bluesy sounding. This question from Jimmy. I'm interested in the Kalamazoo Award. Is this actually a presentation guitar, or is it a guitar line? Well, there was a model called the Kalamazoo Award, which is a F-hole arch top and a pretty fancy one, and was a very good guitar, no longer in production. But Gibson made great arch top guitars, and that's one of the things they were noted for. Orville Gibson built arch tops, and he basically introduced the concept of a carved guitar, carved back and carved top. And the Kalamazoo Award was such an example with some pretty deluxe inlay, but it was a 17-inch wide cutaway acoustic and was a very good guitar. Those were made back in the 80s and are no longer in production, but they are good, at least good for the ones of that period. Howard asked how is Spanish cedar used in Martin guitars. Spanish cedar is neither Spanish nor cedar, but it was called Spanish cedar because it had a resin that smelled very much like cedar and was used a lot by Spaniards for guitar necks. But it's actually a South American wood that's more closely related to mahogany and looks very much like mahogany. Martin guitar necks were made with Spanish cedar right on up through 1917, after which they went to mahogany necks. And also the ones with the Spanish cedar necks typically had a grafted peg head, whereas the ones with the mahogany necks typically have a one-piece neck where the peg head and the rest of the neck are the same piece. But Spanish cedar is not used on production model Martins today. It has been available as an option on Custom Shop. And we did have quite a few Style 21s made some years ago with the Spanish cedar neck. And it's a good looking wood, but it's very, very similar functionally to mahogany. Question from Jay Scott. Why did Gibson use Hollywood on the headstock? Gibson, many of the models had peghead veneers of holly, and they bought their peghead veneers fully inlaid. So they had over the years several different contractors, but Gibson typically, and Martin also, in many cases does not cut their own pearl. They buy peghead veneers and fingerboards made to their specs. So they're not just generic off-the-shelf product, but it's subcontractors that do this. And the peghead veneer is easy to install. They buy it fully inlaid, and then the veneer is simply glued onto the peghead, and the edges can be trimmed, and it can be finished. Holly is easy to paint black, so it can be painted whatever color they want for the front of the peg head, but holly wood itself is very light color. It looks almost like ivory, but it is easily painted, and that's what Gibson did. It was cost effective and less labor intensive for them to buy veneers that were fully inlaid rather than having somebody cut the pearl for them in-house or getting pearl and then having to inlay it themselves. So they got fingerboards and peghead veneers that were fully inlaid. And this is a common practice with manufacturers. And so the quality is good. And Gibson and Martin did this in the pre-World War II era. The work that they could get, the pearl quality was very fine. And these days, a lot of the stuff is cut by laser, and it's even more precise than it's ever been. The laser cutting is so precise that it looks sort of like a mechanical drawing did it. And it somehow has a slightly different feel and look than it just emotional feel. It's not so much not texture to touch, but it just doesn't look quite the same as hand cut. It's almost so perfect that something just doesn't seem natural. But the quality of pearl work on new guitars its laser cut is extremely precise. And with the laser, you can also do the inlay work where there's virtually no filler around it. So it works very well. From the same person, what brand of hangers do you use on your walls? I noticed you use the auto grip for the guitars you sell, but a different brand for your personal collection. What are the brands you trust? Well, we have here a Hercules stand. And you can see it has a gripper. Peg head. See how this, there. So when you put the guitar in it, it does that, and it just grips. So it will never fall. This is great in the showroom. It's also fine on stage. This is a stand here, but they have some that are wall mounted. So you can see right behind me, we have some that are right there on slat wall, and some of them have the Hercules, and some are the string swing brand. And the string swings do not have that grip that closes on it. But for personal collection, it works just fine. I'm not taking them up and down continuously. I'm not worried about somebody putting them up who doesn't know how to do it right. But the Hercules stand is probably, if I had to recommend one stand as being the ultimate, it's great as a stand, and they also have a model that is designed for a wall mount. The string swing has some that will fit in slat wall, and they also have a version that can screw into a wall, and that's you have something at home display because we're not planning on moving the thing around like we do on slat wall. You can have a model that just fastens right onto your wall with 2 screws. But at any rate, those are stands I recommend. I have a further question also from the same person. He mentioned that some stands have reacted with finish. And there are some types of vinyl in particular that will react very badly with nitrocellulose lacquer and damage the finish. And the vinyl on some straps and on some hangers, it's really better product liability. They should not offer these for sale, but they will damage the finish and result in very expensive repair. But the brands that are available today don't typically have that problem. Certainly Hercules or String Swing or any of the ones made in the USA, that's not a problem. It's generally on cheap import items. But that's not one I would worry much about. But he also asks about dust on a guitar. And does that react with guitar finishes? In general, dust is not much of a problem. But if you're cleaning guitars, a lot of dust can be quite abrasive. So if you will take a cloth and rub vigorously, you can scratch the finish. And in general, we recommend using a microfiber cloth, but first blow it. If you have an air compressor or just anything, to just blow or very lightly wipe off any dust without just grinding it in. So you first remove dust that is easily blown off, and then use a good quality guitar polish without silicones or other such stuff in it. And don't rub too hard until you have it clean. And even there, the goal is not to remove all patina from a finish. Trying to make everything look smooth as glass is not necessarily a good thing to do. It will actually reduce value. I've gotten a few new questions in. Mr. Cruz says, I have a chance to get a 2008 Fender Stratocaster American Standard. What can you say about this guitar? Is it just a basic American Strat, gray with maple neck? Do guitars like this just lose value over time? Just a working man Strat, is $560 a fair price, near mint, no case? Well, the price sounds fine, but that sounds like a good deal. Will it lose value over time? The answer is no, not really. The moment you buy one and it's yours, if you want to sell it, it's no longer new with warranty. So it's lost some value right there. But when you resell it, it doesn't have a warranty. When you bought it, it has a warranty. And that warranty is good for you if you have problems. If you resell it, that warranty is not good for the next guy. The warranties typically are only for the original purchaser. But if you take good care of it, does it simply get less valuable as each year passes? In other words, is it like a car that each year goes by, unless it's a highly collectible car, it's worth less and less and less? The answer is no, it's not. It starts out that you buy it as new with warranty. The moment you own it, it's yours. And if you resell it, it's used without warranty. But that warranty is good as long as you own it. So on a Martin and many of these other brands, the warranty is for the life of the instrument or the life of the company, whichever comes first. And Martin, Gibson, and Fender have been around for a long time. So is Taylor. And those companies, they're going to be here. They're not about to close their doors. That warranty is going to be good for as long as the warranty period, which in the case of many of these instruments is lifetime. What Martin calls theirs a limited lifetime warranty because, for example, if you back your car over it because you weren't looking where you were going and you break it, that's not covered by warranty. Therefore, it's a limited warranty. It's limited to defects in their workmanship, but it doesn't cover carelessness on your part. It doesn't cover wear and tear. You can't warranty against wear and tear. But the fact is, if you take good care of an instrument, in many cases, after a while, they go up in value, especially if specs change in any way that would cause the new one to be less desirable. So there's a lot of guitars from the golden era that bring a lot more money than a new one. So that's a consideration. But the example you have given here, though, it's a good deal. There's no reason not to get it. Lawrence H., what are your thoughts on the future of acoustic guitar manufacturing in China? Will they get better or taper off? Also, do you think more manufacturers will go into Mexico? Well, Taylor is doing some very good guitars in Mexico, and their quality there is fine. The factory is only about a 35 or 40-minute trip from their US factory. They have the same supervisory staff, the same type of equipment. They are giving the employees excellent benefits and stock options in the company. So the quality of manufacturing in Mexico is going up. The quality of manufacturing in China has also gone up. Chinese instruments used to be absolutely garbage. That's no longer true. There are some really good ones coming out of China. There are concert quality violins. There's some good mandolins, pretty darn good banjos, and acoustic and electric guitars. Again, out of China are way better than they used to be. And there's a lot of them that I have no problem recommending for somebody who wants to get started. They're good. And many of them are absolutely good enough to take on stage and use professionally. So I can't lump them all together, though. Not all Chinese are equal. It's like saying American guitars, are they better than Chinese? It depends which one. Not all American makers are good, but the best ones are very good. And in China, I would have to say that the best Chinese makers are not at this point equivalent to the best US makers, but they've made tremendous strides and some of them are really pretty damn good. They're way better than they were 10 or 15 years ago. And again, my crystal ball doesn't tell me everything. I wish it did, but I'm predicting that the quality will get better over time from on the import instruments. Alexander asks, are there production records from Gibson indicating how many L1s and L2s were made each year during the late 1920s to the early 1930s? Any thoughts on how many are still around? Well, I don't have accurate figures at fingertips for how many were made, but I can say that Joe Spann on my staff has copies of a lot of those ledgers, and it is possible to go through them and get a pretty good idea how many were made, at least approximately. Not as precise as Martin's records, which they can tell you absolutely precisely how many were made. With the Gibsons, what we can come up with is some pretty close estimates that we know pretty darn well what shows up in the ledgers. Martin's ledgers are more complete to the point of Martin's record keeping was absolutely meticulous. But the answer still is yes, we have a pretty good idea. As far as how many were still around, I would say overall a higher percentage of the Martins survived than Gibsons, especially in the lower priced categories, because many of Gibsons were very lightweight, and frankly, the workmanship wasn't quite as good as the Martins. Martins had the top and back braces tucked into the interior curved linings, and they were far less likely to ever come loose. And guitars that had problems back in the 50s or 60s often got thrown away, simply ended up in the trash. And people didn't realize that they could be repaired, and the quality of repair work available back then wasn't so good either. The art of repair for guitars, banjos, and mandolins has, to a very large extent, evolved almost from scratch in my lifetime. It used to be if your guitar had a big crack in it, you just threw it away, get another one. But by the early 70s, even into the late 60s, there were people realizing that this stuff is worth saving, and that the new ones, even in the 60s, were nowhere near as good as the ones from the 30s. There were, especially in the bluegrass community, people who were well aware of that. And I saw even evidence of that with electric guitars, starting with Mike Bloomfield in Chicago. He really did a great deal to generate interest in vintage electrics. And you could certainly hear the difference in them versus the new ones of the day. The early 60s through early 65, the quality was still very good from Gibson and really quite good from Fender, but after that, it went downhill quite rapidly. Today, it's made up for some of that lost ground, and they've improved, but it still hasn't gotten back to being better than the true golden era. But New ones today still are very respectable and improving. Jeff says, I am curious as to your thoughts on the tree. Some feel it was not the right thing to do in cutting down a 500-year-old tree. My understanding is it was recovered from a ravine after the loggers felled the tree in the wrong direction. What of the argument that cutting down such trees encourages the exploitation of natural resources and should be protected for future generations? Well, if it's going to be protected for future generations to do what with it? If it's for them to use it, then they'd be cutting down a tree that's even older. If it's going to be to preserve an ecosystem, I have to say that sustainable harvest is still not going to destroy an ecosystem, but it has to be a sustainable harvest. And Bristol cone pine can last, trees that have been certified as being 5,000 years old from just tree ring counts, but that's boring a very small hole and pulling out a core sample. And that, nobody's making lumber out of 5,000-year-old trees. Those trees are being carefully saved and preserved, but I'm a strong proponent of having sustainable yield, but a 500-year-old tree is probably nearing its lifetime so far as a jungle forest tree. And that wood is great stuff, although it's very expensive. Stuart McDonald was recently advertising just one set, enough to make one guitar, and they wanted $6,000 for wood from that tree. Trees of that sort certainly should not be clear cutted, but in general, mahogany does not grow in dense stands. It can be done in a sustainable yield, and that's what we think should be done. So I'm not opposed to doing some sustainable harvesting. Otherwise, we'll have no mahogany. But and that's a tree that was big enough to make lots and lots of guitars. That wood is enough to keep some builders busy for a lifetime. In fact, many of the early violin builders could get enough supplies of wood early in their career to literally sustain them for their entire career. If you have a tree as big as the one called the tree, there's enough mahogany in that one tree that an individual luthier could pretty well spend his lifetime building guitars from just that one log. But most builders want a little more variety than that. But the point is, sustainable yield can produce enough wood for our industry. The biggest problem in harvesting is not sustainable yield for the guitar makers. It's not guitar makers at all. It's construction industry, the lumber industry, and often enough, not even use of the wood as wood, but in areas that are third world countries where the standard of living is low and people are hungry and want to feed their family, they will cut and burn the forest simply to clear the land for agriculture, which is usually a poor proposition in tropical rainforest areas because there's very little carbon content in the soil. It's bound up in the living trees and rotting vegetation that is left there on the ground in a forest. And without that, those forests will very quickly disappear, and there'll be no ability either to grow crops because the soil doesn't have enough nutrient in it to support growing crops for more than 3 to 5 years, after which it just turns to just rock hard clay that won't grow anything, and it accelerates climate change. So that is problematic, to say the least. But again, I don't fault them for cutting the tree, especially when it's being carefully selected that they pick out trees that can be quite valuable, but leave the rest and do it in a sustainable manner. I have a question from Jay Pilzer. With the advent of reproductions, have prices of some originals been going down? Some of the new metal body resonator guitars seem to be every bit as good as the originals, if not better. Eastwood is making copies of guitars from the 1950s and 60s that play better and sound as good as the originals. Well, for companies like Martin and Fender, even very, very, very fine repros of originals have not caused the originals to go down in price. On the other hand, with resonator guitars, I have seen that phenomenon. Before National Resophonic offered a new version of the Tricone National, the original Tricones, especially those with round neck, were very scarce and were bringing extremely high prices. And very quickly after National Resophonic introduced new versions utilizing that same design, the prices of the originals plummeted. The new bodies were made every bit as well as the old ones. The technology for spinning the resonator cones is still available today, and one can reproduce them very precisely. The metal does not age and mellow the way wood does. And another very critical factor is that the necks on the new ones are made better. That's not true of all new necks, but at least in the case of the National and Dobro brands, the original necks were pretty funky. Most Dobros and Nationals were made for Hawaiian style. They made a much more limited number with round neck for standard style, and they did not have adjustable truss rods. Their neck shapes were sort of clumsy. The necks tended to warp, and they just weren't all that good. So those who are buying a National Tricone because they wanted that sound when they could get it in a new one for less money and had a neck that was physically more comfortable to play, they switched very quick. So that's an example where prices went down. They didn't go to zero by any means. There's still some good ones out there. In fact, we have a really neat Triolean model right here. This was 1930. Its original finish, the so-called polychrome finish. And that is original stenciling. And it plays very well. And you can see the polychrome finish. It's a multicolored finish. Pretty neat. It actually plays well and sounds good. But, and this one would bring more money than the new replica. But it's almost as clean looking as a new replica. But on the Tricones, those things they did go down. But overall quality of many of the items, such as the new Harmony brand, and the new K brand, Those have better necks and play better than the originals ever did. So the ones that are reviving old brands that were sort of student model instruments, Harmony, Kay, Regal, those are brand names that have been brought back. And in some cases, those actually play better than the originals. And others like the Eastman brand that Jay mentioned, Eastwood, there's Eastman and Eastwood both, but those are both making some very good instruments. And some of the Eastwood models are copies of the old national brand instruments. And they play well and they sound good, in many cases as good or better than some of the originals. There's one last question I'll cover, and that is, do you think James DeQuisto is the greatest luthier guitar maker of all time? No, I don't. I think he was a brilliant maker of archtop guitars. But did he make the best mandolins in the world? No. Did he make banjos? No. Did he make flat top guitars, in my opinion, are better than an old Martin? No. But did he make some of the finest modern jazz style acoustic jazz guitars? He was very, very fine. We have two of them in stock. They're great. And certainly as archtop guitars go, he's one of the absolute best. He died in 1995. He took over D'Angelico's business when D'Angelico died in 64. So from 64 through 95, DeQuisto was building, and his instruments are absolutely as good as those of his teacher, D'Angelico. They're great. And actually, I had one last one from a person who wants to know what their 1963 J45 Gibson is worth. And for that, we have an appraisal service. Go to guitars.com, click on the appraisal button, enter the photos and info requested, which is easy to do online, and within one day, usually same day, you will have a written, accurate appraisal. Anyway, look forward to seeing you next week. Till then, have a good one.